Hello, thank you so much for inviting me. It's really exciting to be here because actually the Wandle Wardrobe project wouldn't have come about without Wandle Fortnight. It actually sort of started as part of a project for Wandle Fortnight in 2020. I live at Bedsted and we were kind of planning like a little outdoor kind of alfresco art exhibition of sort of what everyone had been up to during lockdown, and I'd been furloughed from my day job as a costume maker for 6 months and kind of spent most of my time walking along the Wandle, you know, kind of exploring like sort of the local area. I used to live in Colliers Wood before I moved down to Hackbridge, so I kind of knew parts of it very well, but obviously I didn't know Beddington Park, Beddington farmland, so I was kind of really getting to know my neighbourhood in a way that I probably wouldn't have before lockdown, or it would have just taken me a lot longer because I normally commute into central London for work. So the original project, I've been talking to neighbours about sort of litter picking and things like that during the lockdown, and we've been saying we were finding sort of strange, I think one of my neighbours described it as kind of eclectic or even sort of dramatic rubbish, like people were sort of finding things draped on kind of bushes in Mitcham Common, and at one point someone found a hole that was full of Victorian bottles. So we kind of got quite interested in this idea of sort of eccentric or sort of strange rubbish. And I was actually quite inspired by an artist called Mark Dion, who has an installation in the Tate Modern, which is like a sort of Victorian cabinet of curiosities. He's done a dig in front of the Tate Modern all along the kind of bankside area of the Thames foreshore, but instead of just collecting the sort of small precious things, he's collected everything, sort of modern rubbish like bottle tops and sort of crisp packets, and it's all displayed in this beautiful kind of Victorian cabinet of curiosities, one of those mahogany ones with the very sort of narrow flat drawers. So as you pull out each drawer, some of it you might have bits of Roman mosaic, 18th century pottery pipe, but then you've also got Budweiser caps, you've got sweet wrappers, and I kind of really like the idea of this way of displaying rubbish as though it's precious, or you don't distinguish the rubbish from the precious objects because they're all sort of displayed in the same way. So I decided I was going to focus on textile waste and lost clothes because it's sort of it's kind of a personal passion. Like as a costume maker, one of the things that you're trying to do with costume is create kind of a personality for a character, or show a personality through clothes in the same way that we might buy clothes because it's a band t-shirt for a group we love, or it's something that we think expresses something about our personality. I'm trying to do that as a costume maker for an actor who's kind of creating this sort of fictional persona. So it kind of made me think, what do our clothes say about us? And also, what does it say about us that we're willing to kind of let things go so easily? So kind of one of my other real sort of big interests is sustainable and ethical fashion, because as anyone who kind of might have seen headlines recently about huge amounts of unworn or unwanted clothes being dumped in the Atacama Desert in Chile, in Ghana, outside Cantamanto Market. There's a huge problem with sort of oversupply, overproduction, and then people not making the most of their clothes, just wearing something once and then throwing them away. So that was kind of something else I was thinking about, how a lot of the time our throwaway culture we see through plastic bottles or beer cans along the Wandle, but our throwaway culture also kind of comes through in what we wear or what we leave behind when we visit a kind of natural space like any of the parks along the Wandle. And obviously the other kind of motivation for doing this particular project along the Wandle is obviously, as you all know, the Wandle's history as a site of textile production. So kind of thinking about sort of the Wandle's connections to the textile industry in the past, where textiles were a lot more expensive, probably treated as though they were a lot more precious, and kind of how we treat our clothes now when they're so cheap, so plentiful. So this was probably my best haul of my initial Wandle walk. I walked the length of the Wandle over several days just before Wandle Fortnight started, to kind of have my sort of pile of things to make these 2 initial quilts. And as I was walking up past Watermeads Nature Reserve, it was actually where the bridge was being repaired and they had this hoarding up. Someone had dumped a huge pile of fabrics from sort of the 70s and 80s. I think there's 20 pieces there, so most pieces were sort of 3 or 4 meters. It was obviously someone's fabric collection, but everything was clean, everything was dry. I took everything home, washed it. So I've been making clothes for myself out of that, and I've got enough fabric to kind of keep me going for years now. So talking of washing, everything on the quilts has had a good wash. Most of it's been beside the river rather than in the river, so you don't have those kind of extra problems to deal with. But the idea was to kind of display them as quilts, because you normally associate a quilt with sort of, it's an heirloom piece, it's something that stays in the family, it's something quite precious, and it's also something that someone's put a lot of thought into making traditionally. So I wanted to kind of be able to surprise people with these kind of throwaway or sort of discarded, lost garments displayed in a way that feels like they've been kept, they've been looked after, they're sort of here for the long term. So for the original, so you can actually see the 2 that are on the floor are the 2 up here. So that was everything collected. It was just one walk, sort of the length of the Wandle, but over several days, because I was really kind of scrabbling around in bushes and sort of combing through the park to find various things. So the original layout for our kind of mini art festival for Wandle Fortnight 2020 was this mini Wandle Trail laid out on the Bedstead Field. So I'd taken photos of each piece of rubbish in situ on the walk, and I pegged those out next to this fabric Wandle, so you could walk a sort of miniature Wandle trail, see where the hot spots for rubbish or lost clothes were, and then see everything as it is now on the quilts at the end. So once we'd had the exhibition, I'd also found all of those clothes on the right, with the exception of the T-shirt in the middle that was covered in paint. Everything else was really good quality. So I was back to work at the end of September actually, but obviously as lockdown continued, there wasn't really anything for me to do outside of work, so I carried on doing my walks, picking up the bits and pieces that I found, and the project kind of continued sort of all through April really. And then I sort of started piecing everything together to make more quilts. Yeah, I think one of the things that I was really thinking about as I was kind of getting more into the project, reading more about the history of the Wandle, kind of discovering more about the local area, was how the sort of history of the Wandle and the history of the textile production was almost like a microcosm of bigger problems with the fashion industry. So obviously there's kind of the big issue at the moment is sewage pollution in rivers and sort of beaches around the UK. But one of the previous problems for the Wandle was pollution from the textile mills. And I remember reading an account from, I think it was 1851, of a complaint that had been lodged in Wandsworth about how the river is, you know, you can really see the colours of the dyes that have been used further upstream. And obviously that's not a problem here on the Wandle or really anywhere in the UK, but in places like India, Bangladesh, Indonesia, it's a huge problem because that's where the vast majority of the clothes that we wear, that's where all the fabric's being dyed. Most of the factories there have very poor water recycling, if they have any water recycling at all. All of that water goes straight out back into the river, which is normally the only source of water for drinking, for washing, for local people. And there's sort of a saying, you can tell in some of these areas, you can tell what's going to be the next big colour in Western fashion, because that's the colour that the river's been dyed this season, which is pretty horrendous. So one of the things that was really interesting about the Wandle is these sort of big name designers that are still big names today attached to the Wandle. One of the sort of slightly lesser known names is William Kilburn. That's one of his designs on the left. And William Kilburn actually had a problem which is sort of probably better known to fashion designers today, in that his beautiful designs were being essentially stolen and reproduced at mills up in the north much more quickly than sort of and at scale than he was able to produce them. And I think he actually lobbied for an act of parliament to basically for what we would now call our intellectual property rights. And that's sort of a huge problem today for independent designers who are trying to do the right thing, who are trying to produce sustainably. A lot of the time, their work gets ripped off and remade by fast fashion brands who have sort of none of the skills, none of the ideas, but enough money to make these things at £5 instead of £45. So the original designers, lose out that way. And obviously, sort of probably most famous from the River Wandle, William Morris. He's obviously sort of very well known for his kind of idealism about arts and crafts, this idea of sort of really kind of beautiful craftsmanship, moving away from mass manufacture to having something that's really beautifully produced using sort of the best quality materials that you can afford. And actually that's kind of becoming much more a focus of sort of a smaller part of the fashion industry. The kind of slow fashion movement is really kind of trying to invest back in that idea of using traditional techniques, using more traditional materials, or using materials that last longer, using techniques that create a better finish, and also this idea of treating your workers more fairly, making sure that they have a living wage, making sure that they have a life outside of work, which I think that was kind of one of William Morris's sort of big ideals, and I think that's coming back round. Well, although it's not as much of a problem here as it is for garment workers in Bangladesh or India. It's still a problem in places like Leicester, where they have factories for big sort of fast fashion brands like Boohoo and Pretty Little Thing. And actually they had a sort of huge COVID problem because they were all having to go to work with no social distancing during the lockdowns. A lot of Leicester's lockdown problems were apparently sort of attributed to Boohoo's warehouse and the fact that no one there was able to social distance or wear a mask. So yeah, fast fashion is not good for you in any way, shape or form. So I think for a lot of people, walking along the Wandle was such a lifeline during the pandemic. And in a sense, it was really lovely to sort of have that feeling that you still had a life, because you could see other people also living their lives. You'd see family groups having picnics, having walks, kind of getting outside. Everyone was sort of able to still live a life along the river, which felt very, very reassuring in a lot of ways. And I think part of the project was sort of my reflection on how we were using these sort of local green spaces and how our sort of lost clothes kind of came to be part of that. Like I'd sort of joked it was like a lockdown lost property. but it was quite nice to kind of see other people interacting with some of the clothes. So sometimes, like a lot of the things with socks or scraps, you just find them on the floor, they'd be dirty, they'd be muddy. But I quite liked the way that sometimes people would arrange items where they could be clearly seen by other walkers. So if you did happen to try and go back for your hat or your child's lost mitten, they would still be there. And I kind of developed a rule for myself when I was sort of collecting things that I wouldn't touch anything that someone had left in a sort of prominent spot for at least a week, because I would hope that people would go back for it. Actually, that poor little mitten, because it was hand knitted, that was sort of, I got rather emotionally attached to it because it was there for about a month, and I kept thinking someone's going to come back for it, and then they never did. It was still seeing them as, you know, as a garment with an owner, rather than, you know, you wouldn't kind of ask, oh, who's dropped Evian water bottle is this? But people say, oh, you know, would someone come back for that glove, those mittens, that child's hat? Unfortunately, no one has yet, but I sort of live in hope, and I sort of had to figure out what I was going to do, which I think is to cut off the garment and give it back to them, but to stitch a little outline so you can kind of see that there was something there. So one of my other kind of side projects was making clothes out of fabrics that I'd been finding along the Wandle, and obviously some of them are just kind of quite simple sort of wearable garments. But I wanted to kind of make something that sort of contained like some of my thoughts about the river, about sort of the other occupants of the river. And one thing that kind of came into my mind immediately was egrets. I'd been reading a book called Mrs. Pankhurst's Purple Feather, which is about the sort of simultaneous development of the suffragette movement and of the RSPB, even though the two founders were kind of very much at odds with each other, which is kind of equal parts frustrating and fascinating. So the egret, which is the little white bird that you've probably seen along the Wandle, it was actually hunted to extinction in Northern Europe for use. They used its breeding plumage, sort of from the back of the head, in hats. It was sort of the most desired plumage for sort of hats in the late 18th and early 19th century, and there you can see a sort of example of the kind of hat that someone would have worn. And it was this feather trade, because obviously you can only collect the breeding plumage when the birds are breeding, so obviously it's kind of creating this huge population slump because all of the chicks are dying. And it was actually that kind of led to the creation of the RSPB and the Audubon Society in America as well, and acts of Parliament to prohibit the trade in exotic feathers. So of course the egret is now back on the Wandle, and sort of the Wandle itself had gone through this kind of cycle of being dismissed as a dead river, being very polluted, and it took sort of all these efforts by these different groups of people who all had a stake in the Wandle being a more pleasant river, and the sort of transformation over 50 years, the fact that a species that hadn't existed in Northern Europe for several hundred years has now made this space its home, is kind of, I like the sort of parallels of how people power can get things done. We're not always in a cycle of things getting worse. There's kind of I liked the hopeful message. So that was 2021. This was me, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago. After there was a couple of things. I think there was some news in the Evening Standard about Thames Water releasing sewage into the Wandle. So obviously I found out about this on Friday night. I was furious. I wanted to do something that wasn't just writing rude messages on Twitter, although I did write Thames Water a rude message on Twitter. So my kind of normal reaction to something that distresses me is to do an art about it. So I'd done a quick sort of look online. I was like, oh, I'll recreate my egret dress photo with a photo of me wearing an emoji poo costume. but I suddenly realised I couldn't wait for eBay to deliver me an emoji poo costume. I needed one now. So I made one and went and stood in the Wandle with an angry sign. I unfortunately didn't back it up with any specific scientific evidence, but Thames Water have largely ignored me, so I don't think it really makes much difference. But I was kind of thinking, in contrast to the positive message that that I was putting out in the world with the egret dress, there's also the sort of opposite of that it takes all of the stakeholders to maintain the quality of the river, but it only takes one company with a lot of power to make that so much more difficult for everyone else. And obviously there's a huge amount of frustration there, and it can sometimes lead to feelings of powerlessness, but actually kind of looking around the room and seeing all of the sort of 140 groups that feed into the Wandle Valley Forum, there are huge numbers of us that really care a great deal about the river and care about its history and care about its future. So that's kind of a huge sort of reason for positivity from me. So that's the Wandle Wardrobe. It's currently sort of still there's still sort of bits of it kind of percolating. I'm not completely finished with it.